So I'm not expecting far too many people, but still, let's like wait for a couple of minutes. Okay, so this lecture as well as the lecture on next Tuesday and Wednesday are basically revision lectures. In the previous batch, I just went through uh, lecture, week 0, 1, and 2 in that particular order. And this is what the idea is. I'll just go through the lectures. If you have a doubt, please stop me. Otherwise, I'll just keep speaking in a very fast speed. So please stop me if you want me to answer any particular query. But the idea is that we are just going to look at the lectures in that particular order. Okay, so let's start, guys. And by the way, we are going to have a lecture by Avanish on Sunday. I'll uh, I'll send a sheet to I'll send a form to collect the possible number of candidates if who will be interested to come to that lecture. Again, it's voluntary. It's not a part of the syllabus itself, so you have no pressure to attend it. I just want a head count so that if the head count is less than 100, we can probably have it on Google Meet itself. And other than rather than going on to WebEx. Okay, so let me start. So can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay, great. So let's start. Okay, so this is how the whole journey began. That we said that there are these computing devices like a calculator, and then we said that these are slightly different from the devices like a laptop or a mobile phone, a smartphone, especially. And we said that the basics of computing are that we only learned how to count using some very basic instruments like these. So we learned, for example, how to add two digits, and then we were taught a number system. where we said that if a particular digit is at a different location, it is counted as, let us say, ones, tens, hundreds, or something like this. So this is from where we all started, that this is how a number system is created. And then we said that even though the number system that we use is the base 10 number system, on computers what we use is essentially base 2. Why exactly base 2? I think by now you guys might have already studied transistors. So this what the electronic circuits, the heart of the electronic circuits are basically transistors, and they can have two states, on or off. So the 0 and 1, the two states are basically just the on or off states for transistors. So that's why we have a binary number system, which is easier for the computers to deal with. Then we said that there is something known as Boolean algebra. Boolean algebra is basically the kind of algebra that you can do over these base 2 variables. Because it's base 2, the only possible values are 0 and 1. And then there are three basic functions, and, or, and, not. And will give you the output as 1 if all the inputs are 1, or will give you the output as 0 if all the inputs are 0, and not will simply flip up whatever was the input. If it was 0, it will become 1, and vice versa. Then we said there is something known as the arithmetic logic unit. This arithmetic logic unit is essentially the unit that performs all the arithmetic operations, as well as these logical operations that we just saw. There's another unit called the control unit. The task of the control unit is to perform is to decide basically what computation is performed at what point of time. There's another entity within my computer known as registers or CPU registers. Their job is to store some data in an intermediate computation. The data, of course, is zeros and ones, and a register is basically a collection of certain number of bits, usually 8 or 16 bits, and one byte is 8-bit. So all these things, uh, you know uh, they all constitute the CPU, the central processing unit, which is basically the brain of a computer. And by the way, I'm not looking at your chats, so if you have a doubt, you have to stop me by unmuting yourself. So this is a basic block diagram of a CPU. Now, what exactly is von Neumann architecture? So von Neumann architecture says that if you have a CPU like this, if you attach a memory to it, this is where we are going to store some instructions and data. You attach input and output devices to it, then this is basically known as the von Neumann architecture. And von Neumann architecture was basically the predecessor of all the modern day computers. In fact, the most what I can say is the most immediate successor of von Neumann architecture is basically the stored program computer. What the stored program computer has is something like this. Um, you essentially store some instructions and data within the memory unit. The CPU is supposed to interpret the instructions given in that particular memory location, at one point of time, then use some data items which are also stored in the same memory, perform the expected operation, addition, subtraction, stuff like that, and then store the result back inside the memory. And you need some input and output devices in order to fill up the memory as well as take the output out of the memory. So this was the very basic first lecture from where we all started. Any queries here?
No, sir.
Okay, so let's start with the second lecture. So the second lecture was basics of operating systems. Now here, so basically we said that this is what the von Neumann architecture looked like, and we said that the main memory, or the common term that we use for main memory, is RAM, is where you are going to store all your instructions as well as the data that is required for the instructions to be executed. And this was a particular image that we had. I know that this image is faulty. There are not 16 but 15 elements here, but just assume for now that I never actually got the time to change. Um, so basically, the idea is that if it is a 16 byte memory, you have like 8 bits in each of these boxes, and these each box has a particular address this address is in binary, this address is the same number in decimal, and what really happens is something like this. You fill it up with a program like that, where you have certain instructions, and whatever data is required in this particular program, that is also stored in some particular memory location like this. And then we saw how this particular program gets executed by the CPU. For doing so, it uses some registers. Um, Out of those registers, there are at least two registers that are of of some importance. The first one is actually the program counter. The program counter is a register that never stores a data item. It always stores an address, the address of the next instruction that the CPU is supposed to execute. The AC, the accumulator register, is a register where usually the results of a particular uh, operation is stored temporarily. So this is the common convention that we do usually do not store results in 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 other registers, but the result is actually stored in accumulator, and then from there we try to push it back to the main memory. This is a kind of common convention. um, this is all the same thing. um, yeah, so then we saw exactly how the program gets executed, how the program counter value is incremented by 1 every time a particular instruction gets executed. During the execution of an instruction, you usually bring some data from the memory locations, you store them in different registers, and then you perform some kind of operation over it, like adding something with another thing. And then at the end of it, you store it back into the memory location wherever it is supposed to be stored. So we realized that the memory is used in two different ways. It can store some data item, and at the same time it can also store instructions. A particular instruction is nothing more than, again, a sequence of bits. So the only way you can so basically the only way we can determine if a particular location is an instruction or a data is something that has to be managed by the control unit. So the control unit is going to interpret a particular location as instruction or as data. But if you actually go and look at the contents, they are just zeros and ones. We also saw that you need some kind of convention here, that if a particular memory location is to be treated as an instruction, how do you interpret it? So this is one simple example, that you basically say the first two bits are going to represent a particular operation, some kind of operation code. So here 00 is an operation code, let us say, for the load operation, and because there are two bits, a maximum of four operations can be represented here. Then the second in the next four are basically some address within the memory. This could be a pointer to a particular data. And now you can understand that this is how pointers work, right? 0110 is essentially a pointer to another location, and now you understand where the pointers fall in place. So this is a kind of pointer, and here 11 is a particular register in which I want this particular data, whatever data is there at 0110, to get loaded into uh, the register number 11. So here I'm using two bits to represent a register. All in all, I can represent four registers using two bits, 01101111, then something like this. So for any particular instruction, you have to come up with a particular format. This format depends on the platform you're using. It is platform specific. So for one particular platform, this is fixed. Okay, so then there are input devices. These input devices, are typical input device is a keyboard. The operating system somehow understands how to talk to your input devices, and now I think you guys already know how exactly is that happening. The operating system has some device drivers with the help of which it talks to a keyboard and takes up the inputs. Similarly, the operating system can talk to the output devices like monitor or a laptop's screen. Um, and you have the device drivers for doing this as well. So basically, the major job of an operating system includes managing your input devices, managing your output devices, managing the main memory, and then the coordination with the control unit in order to get some computation done. Any queries here? Okay, let's move on. So then we talked about virtual machines. So we knew that operating systems can do so much things, so many things for us. However, on top of one hardware, you usually run just one operating system. And if you want another OS on top of a base OS, you use something known as virtual machines. And you guys have spent a lot of time, I think, banging your head with VirtualBox. So I think that part should probably be anyhow etched in your memory, but essentially there is a software layer that is known as a hypervisor. The job of a hypervisor is to actually emulate hardware. Okay, so even though it is a software entity, it tries to emulate hardware, and it essentially makes a layer over your operating system, and this layer behaves pretty much like a hardware. Then you can install another operating system over this emulated layer, and that operating system runs over a machine called as a virtual machine. It is not real, but it is virtual. So this is a simple illustration. You have some hardware, you have an operating system over it, and then you install a hypervisor over it, and then over this hypervisor, you have some emulated hardware, and over the emulated hardware, you have a guest operating system. So this is the guest operating system, and this is the host operating system. Um, this I think you guys already know. Okay, any questions on this? Okay. And if you have a question, you have to unmute and ask me. Okay. Okay. So then in the first week, we went to Linux, the world of Linux, and we said that there are many operating systems out there that you can use, but a common operating system that most of the developers use is the Linux operating system. Um, so we also discussed the system booting up process. We said that on your system there is something known as a ROM. Now this we have had a number of discussions over this. I even talked to some of the friends in Intel who work on these things, and they told me that it's not perfectly accurate these days. Most of the systems now have a kind of a flash memory where these programs are stored. But for the sake of understanding, just assume that the initial systems used to have a read-only memory, a place where which can only be read but not written to. And this was read-only memory was part of your system's motherboard, and this place, this ROM used to have the first program that is executed whenever you power on your machine. And as soon as your machine is powered on, a program called basic input output system, or BIOS, is loaded and it is executed. It performs what is known as the power on self test. The power on self test is essentially a test which tries to figure out if your system is in some kind of a runnable state or not. So for instance, in order to boot the system and load your operating system, it probably requires a RAM. It probably requires a keyboard. So some very basic tests, to figure out if the minimum hardware configuration that is required to run the system is there or not. And this BIOS is prepared by your hardware vendor, the company that prepared your motherboard. This BIOS is prepared by them. And now this is more of a detailed block diagram.
Sir,
Yeah, go ahead.
sir, the power on self test, sir, it is found in the modern computers also, or in the old computers
No, it
only?
is there. It is there. The power on self-test happens in the modern computers as well. It's just that the location where BIOS is stored, that actual hardware component, from what I understand, these days it is not really a read-only memory. It's a kind of a flash memory which can be easily updated. That is the idea. Earlier, it was very difficult to. I mean, not difficult. It was still possible. Um, People used to update BIOS as well in the previous days as well, but usually you used to get BIOS updates, let us say, once in a blue moon. So if I remember, my first PC that I had, I think I bought it in what, 2002, and throughout my life, I used it till what, 2011 or something, and throughout that whole period, I think I just updated my BIOS once. So this was the case, that usually the ROM was ROM only, right? I mean, it was only meant to be read and not written. But these days it is stored in a kind of a flash memory, a memory that is very similar to your pen drive, for example, and it can be easily reflashed. So yeah, but yeah, power on self test still happens.
No, sir, but in these days, systems have SSDs, so they load up in 1 or 2 seconds. So, I mean,
No, but
most
the
used to
loading
take
is
up
on a,
some.
no, the loading is something else. So basically, the modern systems are very fast. You can say this, right? But the power on self-test is essentially not it has nothing to do with your actual technology, which is whether your system has an SSD or a SATA hard drive. So that is not the job of Post. Post looks at very basic things. Okay, so for example, does your system has a RAM or not? Without the RAM, operating system cannot be loaded. Does your system have an input device connected to it or not, like a keyboard? Whether your system has an output device. I mean, I really don't know exactly all the tests that happen in power on self test, but the idea is that your hardware vendor, the vendor who created your motherboard, uh, they know that what are the basic requirements for the system to run, and the power on self test is something that just checks whether your system is in that configuration or not. So you might have a RAM but it is not functioning, for example. So the work of power on self test is simply to check whether your system is runnable or not. Does it make sense?
Okay, sir, I have one more question. Then, if you are saying that these days the RAM is, sorry, the ROM is by the flash drive, then also the CMOS chip must also be get
Yeah.
eliminated.
So So basically, the CMOS battery used to be a place where you can store certain preferences. From what I understand, those preferences too can now be they are now saved somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where, because the difference, the actual issue is, how often would you like that flash memory to be rewritten? That I don't know. Whether it is very similar to let us say a memory card where you can read write as many times as you want, or whether it is just it is still a restricted read write memory location. Because see, at the end of the day, from the hardware vendor perspective, you want longevity, right? You want that particular hardware component to not fail. So I really don't know whether they still use something like a CMOS battery or not. This is probably a question for a person who's working in Intel or AMD. They can probably tell you that where exactly are these preferences being stored these days. um, but you do need some kind of a battery component in the laptop or a system, because you know that as soon as you turn off your PC, I'm not talking about laptops anyhow have a battery, but a typical PC, okay, the ones that run that you might have seen, the cabinets and everything,
Yes,
they,
sir. Yes, sir.
yeah, they don't really have a battery in them. So in order to store even some basic information like time, okay, you need a battery where it has to be stored. So I'm really not sure what is the exact current state of the art in that domain. They probably have something that is an equivalent of a CMOS battery or the CMOS battery itself. I don't know. But yeah, the amount of preferences that you are supposed to store in CMOS are not really. I mean, it's probably only a few bytes. So So I'm not sure where where are they storing it these days. If you want, I can talk to a friend and I can get back to you. In fact, if you come to the lecture on Sunday, you can probably ask this question to Avanish as well. He works in Qualcomm. Qualcomm also produces these hardware devices, so maybe he too can answer that. Otherwise, I can ask a friend who works in Intel, and he can certainly answer this. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
sir.
So this is more of a detailed block diagram of a computer. Here you can see that now I have included a motherboard, a ROM, and I am trying to show that CPU is present on this motherboard with ROM and memory. The memory here is basically the main memory, RAM, and then input and output devices are there. And now in order to understand how, again, this too has changed the whole concept of a boot sector. Um, uh, Prior to the UEFI, and why UEFI is the, I don't really know how to pronounce it, so I simply call it UEFI, UFI or whatever it is, IFI. So there is a new standard which is going to replace BIOS. But yeah, anyhow, let's not talk about it. The idea is that whenever your system is powered on, there needs to be a program that has to be executed. The first program that has to be executed, that is of course the BIOS. And once the things start into the, once the post is over, then that the system is now runnable. You now need to start the booting process. Booting process, as in you have to load your operating system into the main memory. So to do that, the first program that tries to load your operating system, or that loads a program which in turn loads your operating system, is known as the bootloader. And where exactly to find the bootloader? That bootloader is found in the boot sector. Now, in the previous, in the, maybe a few years back, I would say, the boot sector used to be the first sector of a particular device. It could be your hard drive, it could be a pen drive, it could be, let us say, a CD drive. But it has to be the first sector of that drive. And there, a small program was stored, which somehow knew how to load your operating system. um, but nowadays, with the things changing, I think you can now make the boot sector to be some other sector on your disk as well. But for our purposes, let us just assume that boot sector is the first sector of a particular drive. So here you can see that the possible places from where you can probably boot your system are these places. And if you say, I want my system to boot from the hard drive, the first sector of your hard drive should have a special program, the bootloader, which should be able to initiate a chain reaction, which finally ends up with your operating system being loaded. So this is the overall concept of a bootloader. And bootloader is a term that is usually connected with the Linux environment only, even though the word kernel is there in other operating systems as well, like Windows. But the term bootloader is usually associated with Linux only. Um, the bootloader is essentially the program that starts loading up of your Linux kernel. So what exactly is kernel? We'll just come to this. The kernel is essentially the core of your Linux operating system. It is basically the set of assembly language programs which can talk to your hardware. When I say hardware, I mean the main memory, the input devices, the output devices, so on and so forth. And these programs, now you can understand that these programs are the device drivers. So a very, the same picture that we have seen before, if you want to show the kernel, it looks something like this, that the lower end of your operating system is probably the Linux kernel. And there are different Linux flavors, by the way. What we say when I say flavor, it means that there are different Linux variants that are available out there that you can actually install. But one thing that you still need, the bare minimum that you require, is something known as a shell. The reason for having a shell is that Linux kernel is just a collection of programs. And if you want to communicate with the Linux kernel, you need some kind of communication mechanism. So a shell is a collection of many programs with the help of which you can talk to the kernel. So please keep this in mind that the shell itself is not a part of the kernel, but usually whenever you download a Linux kernel, the shell comes along with it. And the reason for it is that you need at least one way to talk to your kernel. The most common shell that we use is the bash, and other than the shell based interface, you also have you can directly talk to the kernel by building some kind of desktop environments where these are essentially UI based applications which are much more richer in their user interface. So now this we can see this diagram as like this. The Linux kernel is at the bottom, and then there are applications and programs. These applications and programs could be as the shell based programs like awk or set or vi. Vi is an editor, or they could be something that is much richer like a desktop environment. So this is so you all know that Ubuntu is an example. Yeah, so there are many different distributions of Linux. So the most common one are basically the Fedora ecosystem, the Red Hat open system, the OpenSUSE system. And then for most Linux distributions, you will have like two versions. One will be the server version, and another one will be the desktop version. They are just collections of different types of programs. The server versions are lighter versions. They usually do not have GUI. I mean, usually, as in they don't have GUI, and the desktop versions have some desktop environment. Common desktop environments are LXDE, KDE, XFCE, and then you have these variants like Lubuntu, Kubuntu, or Xubuntu to have Ubuntu with these desktop environments. I think this part we can simply skip. That we have already seen. Yeah, file system. So basically, whenever you store some data on your hard drive, there has to be a system in which the data is stored. The management of this data is done through a file system. A file system is something that arranges your file on your disk in one or many ways. There are some examples of these file systems like FAT32, NTFS, ext3, ext4. Now, certain operating systems might only support a subset of these file systems. In fact, from what I know, the modern day Linux systems support all major file systems. Windows, I'm still not sure. I'm not that well aware, but as far as I know, Windows probably does not support ext3 and ext4. I'm not aware of the later versions of Windows, but I think up to Windows 7, I can tell you that it did not support ext3 or ext4. So ext3, ext4 are very common with the Linux-based systems. And one more thing that did someone ask a question? Okay, so so one more common knowledge that you need to know. It's a detail, but still it's good to know that there is something known as an LVM, the logical volume manager. So basically, LVM is a way in which is used on many Linux distributions where you actually uh, provide a layer over your physical hard drives or physical drives, I would say, and with the help of which you can create a kind of pool where your different partitions are merged together to show as if it's like one large monolithic partition. Many a times it is very useful. So there is something known as an LVM. You don't really need to go into the details of these things. You'll probably learn more about LVM in your course on operating systems. Installation notes, we don't really need to discuss these. Any queries, guys? Okay. Okay, so then the second part of this lecture was essentially going into the details of the Linux kernel as well as some of the utilities that Linux provides you, including the shell. Um, So one analogy that is there is that if your computer is kind of a restaurant and the applications that are running on it are something like a customer of a restaurant, then kernel is basically the employee that serves you the food, right? So you give your order to the employee goes to the kitchen is basically the hardware, and whatever you want, you simply get the order. You don't really know how exactly was it prepared. It is the job of the server to get the dish for you. So similarly, kernel provides an interface called system calls. A system call can be used to make requests to the kernel for different types of services. These services usually include interacting with the hardware or managing something related to the hardware. The system calls is basically, as I said, a set of system calls are fixed for one particular kernel. You have to, so whatever job you want to do with your computer, with whatever task you want to do, they have to be composed in such a way that the different system calls provided by your kernel can be used in order to build a solution. So uh, yeah, so these are some outcomes. So now this is a common example that if you want to create a file, there are certain system calls to open a file, write something on a designated place on the disk and then close the file. So there is an application for it called cat. In fact, when we talk about shells, especially the bash shell, we have to understand that shells are a kind of a meta application. They are application on their own, that which is basically going to interact with the kernel, but they also give you the interface to run other applications. And what are these other applications? These are command line applications like cat, for example. Okay? On a typical desktop environment, you can open a terminal, which is basically a shell emulator, and you can do that on Ubuntu using Control Alt T. Then the most common command that some of the most common commands that are used on bash include cat. So cat is a command that can create a new file for you. You do something like this cat, and then this redirection operation, the the redirector, to the file symbol, and then whatever you write after that, that goes inside the file. If you want to print the contents of the file, you simply put it like this, cat space and then the name of the file. Similarly, there is a man command. Man command gives you the manual for any particular shell command. So this is again a kind of a meta command which allows you to open manual pages for other commands, something like this. Then there is an ls command. The job of the ls command is to show the current directories listing like this. You can use -l to show it like this in a column by column fashion. Then there is this cd command which can be used to change your current directory from one directory to another directory. Then there is this yeah, if you do cd dot dot, you will go back one step in the hierarchy. If I am here at examples introduction, cd dot dot will take me to examples, and another cd dot dot will get me back to the home directory. And just typing cd and space and cd and enter will take you back straight away to the root directory, the home directory. The pwd command shows you the current working directory, pwd like this. The mkdir command allows you to create a new directory within any particular directory. The grep command is used to search for a particular text inside a particular file or a set of files. And the find command, the difference between find and grep is that grep searches for text within within a set of files, whereas find is used to find the files themselves. Okay, so there is some very peculiar syntax that they have. You should probably read the man commands to know more. The clear command simply clears your screen. I think we have used this command in some of the programs as well, where I think the linked list program has it, where we use this command to clear the screen. There are some popular editors on Bash as well. I personally use VI. There are others like Nano, for example. So this is used to edit files when you are on a command line interface only. there are some editors like sed, which can be used as a very a very compact way of changing file using some patterns. The sudo command stands for super user do. So if you want to run a command as an administrator, you simply prefix sudo to that command, and then that command gets executed. This is a common example. If you want to install something, you need to use the sudo command. And then we finally, I think before ending, we installed the C compiler, the GCC. There was this command, build essential. This is a collection of certain utilities, including the GCC. GCC is our C compiler. Okay, any questions? Okay.
Sir, kernel is different for different versions of Ubuntu, like Ubuntu
No,
18.4.
no. Yeah. So it's like this. The kernel versioning is a completely separate process. The kernel versions are like 3 point something or 4 point something. What happens is these distributions, when they provide a newer version of their own operating system like Ubuntu or Fedora, they start with some base kernel. So they say that we are going to start with 3 point something or 4 point something, and then they build applications using that kernel. Now over a typical period of the lifetime of a particular operating system's variant, there are updates to the kernel. So you can, for example, update your kernel from version 3.x to 3.y, something like this. So the idea is that overall the kernel development is something that is decoupled from the development of your operating system. Okay, the operating systems like Ubuntu, for example, they use a kernel, and that, so for example, if there are two variants, let us say Ubuntu X and Ubuntu Y, and they are using kernel 3.z, it is possible that two different Ubuntu versions are using the same kernel, or in fact two operating systems of completely different types. So Fedora A versus OpenSUSE B, they might actually be using the same kernel. That is the idea.
Okay, sir.
So now from here onwards,
Sir,
we start.
what
Go
is
ahead.
the use of grub command?
grep, 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 right?
Grub, Grub.
Grub. So basically, there are certain things that you have to do in order to install your operating system, and you remember that there is a bootloader, there is a boot sector, all those things. So essentially, when your operating system has to be loaded, there is a process that has to be followed. For now, just assume that the grub command is used whenever you. So there are commands for updating the grub, for example. So the idea is that if there is a change in the configuration that you want to have, there are certain um, what can I say, the run. So whenever your operating system is loaded, you can provide some inputs to it. We actually did not discuss command line arguments in this course. In fact, now I realize that is a mistake. I should have covered command line arguments. But yeah, so idea is whenever you run a program, you can provide some inputs at the start of the time. So the same thing is true with an operating system as well. You can actually supply some preferences to your operating system, and if you want to change those preferences, you have to change the grub. Okay. uh, uh, I mean, this is something that is beyond the discussion here, but you can send me an email. I will reply you back on email. Okay. So yeah. Any other queries, guys, related to Linux in general? I mean, not too advanced because we can't take them here, but yeah, anything in general about Linux. Okay, let's just go through week 2. So in week 2, we actually reached the level where we could talk about algorithms and procedures and coding. So we took this example of a quadratic equation. A typical quadratic equation is can be expressed in this form: ax square plus bx plus c equals 0. And if you want to actually solve a particular quadratic equation, there is a particular way to do that. You calculate the discriminant b square minus 4ac. Then there are some conditions. What happens if the value of t is greater than 0, less than 0, or equal to 0, and then based on that we can find the roots of a particular quadratic equation. So now this is what we saw, that if you are supposed to explain it to someone, if you already know how to solve a quadratic equation and you are supposed to explain it to someone in a step-by-step fashion, how would you do that? You will probably write something like this, and this is a very simple example of an algorithm to solve a quadratic equation. Now, an algorithm is basically nothing more than just a sequence of well-defined steps. Now, one of the problems with algorithms that we have already seen is that the level at which an algorithm is defined, there is really no defined restriction. So it could be at a very high level, or it could be at an extremely detailed level. There is really no way you can say one is an algorithm and the other one is not an algorithm. So this is a problem that algorithms have, that and they are just they are meant to be consumed by human beings and not computers. Okay, computers cannot understand what an algorithm is. So we need a way in order to communicate this to the computer, and we need something known as a program and a utility known as a compiler, which can somehow interpret whatever we want into the language, into the realm of a computer. This in something similar to what we saw in week 0, zeros and ones. So one of the things that you have to do whenever you are writing a particular algorithm is to figure out what will be the inputs to this particular algorithm. And so for example, in this particular case, if you are trying to solve a quadratic equation in the form ax square plus bx plus c, the only thing that you really want is the values for a, b, and c, the three coefficients, and the rest you can figure out, right? Because your roots can be derived using the values for a, b, and c. So this was a typical diagram that we saw, that in this particular algorithm, these are the three inputs, and these are the two outputs. We need two, at max you get two outputs, where the two outputs are the two roots. So then we said that the algorithms, as we saw, is they are probably, they can actually be written in simple English, and it's very difficult probably to even figure out what level they are. So another and of course, if you want this stuff to be executed, we need a program. So kind of an intermediate step between an algorithm and a program is a pseudocode. So pseudocode is not really executable. It cannot directly be executed by a computer, but it closely resembles the program written in some particular programming language. And this is an example. In algorithm, you write it something like this: if t equal to 0, this is the only root. In pseudocode, this is how you write it. And then we said that so this is an example of pseudocode. Now you know that procedures are essentially a kind of a counterpart for functions. In terms of pseudocodes, you say that a procedure is essentially a collection of instructions that perform a specific job. It can take some inputs, it can give out an output, and in this case of quadratic equations, we saw that the discriminant calculator can actually be coded as a separate procedure altogether. Now, okay, so I think here what you are giving is that there are three inputs to this discriminant calculator, and then there is an output that is D. Any questions? No? Okay. Someone has a question?
So pseudocode thing is only for the beginners, or the pro coders also use this pseudocode?
See, as it's like this, right? It is more of a brain conditioning. When you are a beginner, you might find it hard to think about logic, right? So in the beginning, you first have to learn how to put your thoughts properly in a framework. So at that time, pseudocode helps you, right? So it's more of a constrained language. It doesn't require that you use the syntax of a language. So otherwise, you have to take care of, difference between double equal to and single equal to. But at the same time, you are trying to write stuff in a more standardized fashion, so that you can then convert it into a program. But as you grow as a professional, as a computer science professional, um, we actually start writing code directly, because then your mind is developed enough to think about logic in terms of the syntax of a particular language. So if you are a C coder or a C++ coder, you start thinking in terms of C or C++, terminology. You don't really need to write pseudocode. Okay. Any
Okay.
other query? Okay. Two. Okay. So then the next thing we discussed was variables and constants and library functions. So in order to figure out what will be a variable and what will be a constant, it takes up some time. So especially if you are a beginner. So because sometimes you might feel that in a typical quadratic equation program, it is the x which is the variable. But no, these are the things how they actually get changed when you are trying to write the code for so you are trying to write a generic program which can solve any quadratic equation. So at that point of time, you need to figure out what are the variables, and here the variables are actually a, b, and c. Okay, and this is the idea that you have to pick up. um, the constants here are essentially things like, in b squared 2 is the constant, 4ac 4 is the constant, 2a 2 is the constant. So these are the constants, whereas everything else, a, b, c, capital D, x, x1, x2, whatever it is, they are all variables, right? So in your typical procedure that you wrote, these are all your variables now, and these are all your constants. So a library function is basically a function. It's basically a piece of code that you have not written, but you are trusting someone else. That person, that set of people, they already know how to solve this problem. So whatever they say is the solution to this, I'm simply going to take their word for it. So library functions are essentially predefined functions. They are a set of code that is already available for you to use, and you trust the person who wrote that, and you simply use it in your own programs. A library function, the typical example of library function is the sqrt function. It might be a bit tricky to write the square root function on your own. So if there is a library in a particular language which provides you the square root function as a facility, you simply use it straight away. Okay. Any queries? Okay. Okay, so from here onwards, we actually ventured into C, and the first program in C that we wrote was basically for this quadratic equation itself. We wrote this program. So you guys know, actually you now know what this part is. But yeah, we started from here, that this is the idea of creating a variable, and here we are creating three variables A, B, and C. What exactly is creation of a variable? Essentially, within the main memory, you are going to reserve some space. The actual amount of space depends on the type of the variable. Here, the type is integer, which is usually 4 bytes, and then this equal to operation is going to say that in that 4 bytes of within the memory, please go and write 1 as a value. Then this is the example of a particular library function sqrt being called, and uh, this is the example of a header file math.h. A header file is generally a collection of function declarations. They are not definitions, but usually declarations. It is not necessary. You can certainly write a header file which also has definitions, but usually people only put declarations in them. The idea is that you within your program you include a header file which defines a number of functions. The idea is that you're going to use any of these functions. During the compilation process, the compiler only wants to see if there is a particular declaration for the function that you are trying to use. The actual code for the function, the definition of the function is usually provided in the form of object code. Okay, and these libraries are usually having an extension called .o or .so, where the object code of the functions that are associated with that particular library is stored. And if you remember, for using the math.h library, you had to put a -lm switch while you were using GCC. That is because the linker otherwise will have a problem with it. But in general, the job of a header file is to collect certain number of declarations. Any functions that you want to use from that library must be defined in that particular header file. And this is the simple example of how computation is done in C. You write expressions, like this, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, whatever. You can also do logical operations. You have to make sure that if you're not absolutely sure which particular operator will be evaluated when, then you have to use things like parenthesis. This just makes sure that this particular expression gets evaluated first rather than, let us say, root t by 2. And this is the example of printf. Printf you all have used a number of times. The main is basically a special function within a program from where the execution of the code starts. Any program that has to be executed must have a main function. The printf function, you can see these are the format specifiers. %d is the specifier for integer, %lf is for double, %c is for char. You all know how to find out what these format specifiers are, and then whatever the format specifiers you provide, you have to give these values in the same order. Um, so okay, arguments matter. Running the first program. So here is what I was talking about, that because this uses the sqrt function, you have to provide the object code for the sqrt function, and that you do by giving the -lm switch to the linker. If you want to understand more on the differences between compiler and linker, you have to go and watch that digression lecture. There will be a lecture by Avnish also this weekend, so you can probably come to that lecture as well. You can ask these questions to Avnish as well. Okay, so this is it. Any questions here? We just have one more lecture to
Can
go
you
through.
repeat the
Go ahead.
linker and that part, mat.h
Yeah, so,
part? Can you repeat?
yeah, so essentially what happens is something like this. The header files, they only contain declarations usually. Okay, there's no restriction. If you are creating your own header file, you can always put the the definitions of your functions as well, but usually we only put declarations there. And the idea is that if I want to use a particular function, its declaration must be available for the compiler. The compiler actually doesn't look for the actual code, the definition of the function. That is not the job of the compiler. The job of the linker is to actually, at the time of building an executable, the linker tries to figure out the definitions for all the functions that are defined or used in your code. So at that point of time, it needs to know where is the definition of, let us say, a particular function that you have used. At that point of time, at the time of this job, the job of linking involves bringing together object codes from different sources and then putting them together in one executable. So the linker will look for, let us say, the code for your sqrt function, and by default your math library is not included in the process of linking. The standard input output library is, by the way. So that is why you don't need to provide a specific switch to call printf and scanf. But for using sqrt, you have to give a specific switch. You have to tell the linker that I'm using a function whose object code is present in this particular shared library, and then the linker uses the code and then finally produces your executable. Okay, so the idea is that, yeah, go ahead.
And so where these codes are stored of the
So there
functions.
is a special location. All the standard libraries, there is a special location on your system. Again, it could be probably USR include. The common extension for this is .so, shared object. Okay, so you can check on your Linux system where are the .so files stored. Usually it should be somewhere in the include directory, USR include or USR local include, somewhere there you can find the .so files. These SO files are basically the place where the object code for your standard library functions are there. Any other queries?
Okay, so sir, in short, that you are saying that math.h does not contain the code for POW or SQRT.
Yeah,
It just contains the
declarations.
declaration.
Yeah, the code is present in the .so files. Okay, so this is why we studied that definition is different from declaration. Okay, any other queries, guys? Okay, we have just one more lecture. Let's just finish it off and then we'll break. Okay, so this is the second part of that lecture. Here, actually, the first program that we wrote, there the values of A, B, and C were fixed by us. Now we are going to take that as an input from the user. We are going to use the scanf function. So now, something that you have to understand with scanf is that scanf scanf expects formatted inputs, simply similar to how printf provides you formatted output. Scanf expects formatted input. So in this particular case, I'm expecting that the user is going to type it exactly like this, that the user will type A equal to 5, comma, space, B equal to 6, comma, space, C equal to 10, right? Something like this. If you write anything else other than this, then scanf will not be able to parse this input. So the idea of scanf is that you can give it a format string and it expects the user to put the inputs in exactly that particular format. By default, scanf has some ways in which it can differentiate between one input and another. That includes things like spaces and special and new line characters. So if you simply say scanf x and then you do scanf for y, and then you put a space in between the values of x and y, scanf should be able to parse it. But in general, scanf, if you write something like this, sorry, something like this, a equal to percenting and something like this, then scanf expects that you type it as it is on the screen, like this. Yeah, so one more thing is let /n, whenever you use /n means a new line character. Parenthesis, yeah. So whenever you type an expression, you have to be sure that you understand the concept of precedence of an operator. The precedence is not the same as BODMAS in arithmetic. Each language will have its own precedence of operators, but usually slash and asterisk have the same precedence, and whichever appears first from left to right gets executed first. Usually plus and minus will have a lower precedence as compared to slash and asterisk. But wherever you are in any kind of doubt, it is better to use parenthesis. So in order to use that will make sure that the execution works in exactly the way you want it to be. Yeah, so we know that in each operator has a particular precedence. The operators with higher precedences are evaluated first by the compiler, and for two operators of the same precedence, whichever gets executed first is decided by the associativity. Most of the operators in C are left to right associative, so this means that whichever is present on the left will be evaluated first. There are some examples of operators with right to left associativity as well. You guys know what I'm talking about. And then this is just a sample evaluation. Yeah, we are done. Okay, any questions? Okay, guys, so this was a very fast-paced revision. I mean, again, the idea was not really to tell you everything. This was just revision. And I think I've already taken a lot of time. So we are not having a class on Monday, as I told you guys already. We'll have a class on Tuesday and Wednesday. That will be the last two lectures of the course, and we'll have a makeup exam on Sunday. Some of you are already uh, interested in taking it up as a practice exam. You are welcome to do that. And on Sunday, the makeup exam will be mostly on Sunday afternoon. It will just be a half an hour exam, and uh, we'll have lecture from Avnish in the evening at 6 p.m. Okay, guys, thank you.
Sir, in a makeup exam, if someone score more than which you get in the first one, then it is considered. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's only 25 marks, up to 25
No,
marks.
it's so basically so it's like this. Out of 50, you can only score 25. It's like this, right? Because the midsem was of 50 marks. So now, if you scored more than 25, it doesn't make any sense because at max you can score 25. So your score in midsem will be considered and not this score. But if you scored less than 25 in midsem, you stand a theoretical chance, right? Because if you score more than that, then this score will be counted instead of your midsem score.
Okay, okay, I got it.
Right? Yeah. Any other queries or? Okay, guys. So we'll probably meet. I'll probably see some of you on Sunday. I'll I'll share another form to collect the responses from you. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye, sir.